Okay, hi everyone, we're live, and thanks for joining us in another WIN seminar. And today we're really happy to host Janice Chen. Janice did a PhD at Stanford University with Anthony Wagner, focusing on prediction and novelty in the human medial temporal lobe, and then continued to do a postdoc at Princeton University with Uri Hasson and Ken Norman, studying the temporal dynamics of brain systems supporting episodic memory, and she's now an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. And we're really happy to have you here today, and welcome. Just before we start, a quick reminder of what most of you guys probably know by now about the control features of Crowdcast. So there are two ways to ask questions. For clarifications, questions, or links, or anything that's on your mind, you can use the chat on your right. There, the audience might be able to help you with your question, or you can talk about what Janice is saying. I'll be monitoring that, and if there are any burning clarification questions, I will refer them to Janice. For any deeper questions or more, or questions that have a bit more of a discussion about them, please use the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and those questions, we'll go through them at the end of Janice's talk. And I'll also invite you to the screen to ask a question and discuss with Janice, unless you state in the question that you don't want to be asked to the screen, and then I can ask the question for you. So with that, thanks again for coming, Janice, and the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to get to share this new work with everybody. I'm really excited about it. Thanks so much for the invitation to speak at this seminar. Let me share my screen. Oops. Uh-oh.
Yeah, it's all right. I'll invite you again.
Okay.
One sec. So I think you just you are already okay. I'll kick you out and re-invite you.
Okay.
Okay. I think I see what.
Okay, got it. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Let me try it again. Okay,
yeah,
that's looking okay?
Excellent, yes.
All right. Okay, let's get going. I'm going to be talking about brain dynamics underlying memory for continuous natural events. And in the first few minutes of this talk, I'm going to say some very obvious things just to prepare you. So please bear with me, and hopefully it will get more interesting as time goes on. So imagine that you run into your friend on the street and you ask him, what have you been up to today? You know, we don't necessarily see each other that often anymore. And he says, well, not a lot. I got up pretty early. I went for a run on a new route. I was crossing the bridge. There was an accident and a fire truck was arriving, so I had to wait a few minutes. And then I decided to go to the post office, where I saw Jeff, and we waited in line for a while, and we talked about the post office and voting and stuff, etc. And he went on to the park. Got caught in the rain, and his phone got wet, and now it's broken. All right, so this is a little typical story that somebody might tell about what happened to them that morning. This is 175 words long. And now contrast that with this list of 175 random words. So I'm not going to read any of this to you, but you can see that it doesn't form any coherent sentences or a story. And now imagine that this was a memory test. Don't actually try to do this. My point is just that obviously the story of his day is much easier to remember. Even if I read you that random list 2 or 3 times, you'd probably still be better at reproducing the story. And obviously this is kind of cheating, because when you remember the story, you're able to draw on existing knowledge about how this class of word list typically looks. And the class is a story about familiar events. Whereas with random words, there's nothing to help you remember. It's just babble. But, it isn't just a list of words. It's a list of ideas. You won't be able to reproduce it verbatim, although you would still be closer to verbatim than the random list, probably. You'll probably make a lot of errors in which you'll replace words with semantically similar words or phrases. And it also isn't just a list of ideas, it's a list of events or situations. Each one of these is a little scenario that you have some familiarity with. And you could picture something, maybe you did while I was talking, or you could guess features about it even if you don't have direct experience with it. If I ask you all to guess which objects were in this post office scene, even though he didn't describe any of them, there would be a lot of overlap between you. You are highly, highly trained in these classes. Actually, you spent your whole life training for this. And you could call these schema. I think that's a fair enough use of the term because the term is pretty broad. Sometimes people would call each event a schema or a specific series of events a schema. And you've heard earlier in the same seminar series from Chris Baldessano, who has done beautiful work on the neural representations of event sequence schema using naturalistic stimuli. Now, one thing that he and others have helped show is that information about naturalistic events, which is often called the situation model, is represented in default mode network activity patterns. So to quote Ranganathan Ritchie here, a situation model is a mental representation of the relationships between entities, actions, and outcomes. It's like a schema that specifies the gist of the spatial, temporal, and causal relationships that apply within a particular context. And those ideas are rooted in ideas from the psychological literature several decades earlier. So we have these events or situations, and is that how we're going to ace this memory test? I think there is still one important thing missing from this picture. It isn't just a list of events. The events are connected to each other in a specific pattern by shared elements and cause-effect links. So some of these events have the same set of people in them. Some of them have conflict, some are surprising, and some of them cause other ones. In this talk, I'm going to focus on one specific way that we're developing in my lab to operationalize the structures of naturalistic event sequences and to predict memory for them. And we do this by measuring the connections between all events, which makes a network of events. And we do this with audiovisual movies that people watch during fMRI. So how do we turn a movie into a graph, and how do we use the graph to predict memory? Well, first of all, this work is done entirely by my incredible postdoc, Hong-Mi Lee, like all of the work. And in this experiment, people watch 10 short movies, and then they perform free spoken recall, all in the scanner. The movies are 3 to 10 minutes long. They have a wide variety of styles and content. Some are animated, some have no language and just music. Some are happy, some are more dark. And we'll use semantic similarity and cause-effect relationships to identify patterns of connections across events. And we'll use those to predict recall behavior and also brain activity. And our starting hypothesis is pretty simple. Events that are more interconnected with each other, with other events, we think are the ones that will be best remembered. And this property of interconnection, we think, will drive default network activity. So that is, we think that not only does default network activity carry representations of situation models, as has been shown before, it's also modulated by information about the connections between events. Now, the behavioral part of this hypothesis is motivated by findings from that same psychological literature. And these classic studies on story comprehension have reported that the number of causal connections with other events predicts the perceived importance and memorability of an event. And this is often done with experimenter design stories where they can kind of pop in and out different pieces of the story to change the number of causal connections. This is a very rich literature. I still have a lot of reading to do, but I will take this opportunity to plug our new review paper, which is not a review of this older literature because it's in current opinion. It's more of a review of the modern descendants of this literature. Okay, so onto the paradigm. We have people come to the scanner and watch movies during fMRI and then do spoken recall. And I'm going to play a clip of one of these movies. I think the sound is not going to come through, but it's okay because there's no language anyway. I'll stand close and see if you can get some of the sound. Okay, so that's a clip from one of the short animated movies. And here's a clip of somebody talking about this movie later on.
And she puts the record on, and it starts playing. And as it starts playing, she finds she's holding this slice of pizza, and when she's about to put it in her mouth, she finds that it's like already eaten. And then she realizes that it has to do with the record. So when she spins the record one way, the pizza becomes whole again, and then when she spins it another way, it sort of shortens, and so then she spins it all the way, and all the pizza is gone.
All right, so some of you may recognize this paradigm as being exactly the same as what we used in the previous paper, where we had people watch BBC's Sherlock for about 50 minutes and then do free unguided recall. The main difference here is that we have 10 different movies, that unrelated in content. At the end, the subjects still get no cues for their recall, so they just are told to go, and they recall the movies in any order they choose. And they don't even get like they don't get a title cue during the session that I'm going to talk about today. So they just start talking, and they may or may not remember all of the movies. All right, to do this analysis, first you have to do some scene segmentation. So we take the movie and we break it up into scenes. That number 50 is how many scenes there were in the Sherlock movie, and for this film festival data set, it's closer to 200. And then we have people label every one of those scenes. And this is done by humans, and I'll refer you to some cool work that's going on looking at data-driven segmentation approaches for naturalistic movie data. But we do this with people, and then we go to the recall and we try to find those same scene boundaries and match them together. And this is done by people. I don't know yet of a very good way to do this automatically, because you're talking about people saying anything that they want, and you usually need a person to really accurately identify what part of the movie they're referring to. They say a lot of different kinds of things. Okay, so in Sherlock, the behavior looks like this. The story is quite linear, mostly in chronological order, and people will talk for anywhere between 10 or 45 minutes about the 45-minute movie. And just so you know how to read these plots, time during movie is on the y-axis and time during recall is on the x-axis, and each one of those boxes is a scene in the movie. So you're seeing that those boxes running along the diagonal are the person recounting each one of the scenes, mostly in order. If you're seeing boxes off of the diagonal, it's because they are telling that scene out of order. Now, in the 10 movies data set, we see a different kind of behavior. So again, each little box is a scene, and you can see that the scenes are a bit shorter than when we had done the segmentation for Sherlock. And each one of these chunks is an entire short movie. So as you might imagine, people tend to talk about one movie at a time. They tell all of the events in sequence as they remember them, because that's what a story is. And so you'll have these kind of chunks of entire movies, and then those little boxes are the events in the movie. And people jump around, so I'll just show you two more. Everybody has their own way of doing this, and sometimes it's because they don't remember what order the movies were actually shown in. Sometimes they just choose not to tell them in order. Okay, so you have this varied behavior. First, we take a look at kind of classic serial position effects. So these are the kinds of effects that you think of in random word list learning. At the story level, are the 10 movies recalled in chronological order? Yeah, they're in order moderately. So even if you take out the first and the last movie, it's still significantly in order. But this is not a very good experiment for that question, because it's like having a list of random words that's only 10 words and you didn't test any other lists. But people tend to do this in order somewhat. And at the event level, so now we'll have 10 movies, and all of the events within each movie are those events recalled in chronological order. And the answer is yes, they're recalled very strictly in order, ridiculously strictly in order, because you're actually telling a story, so the order matters. At the story level, do we see primacy and recency effects, right? Do we see higher probability of recalling the beginning and end? In the movie level, sort of, but and I wouldn't write home about that effect. There's a big bump in the middle, so it's kind of yes, kind of no, but again, it's only 10 items. At the event level, we can look at all 10 movies, and we actually see that there is no primacy effect and no recency effect when people are recounting stories. And Jeremy Manning and his group found the same thing when they did this analysis for the Sherlock movie. So this, maybe you wouldn't expect recency anyway, because the recall occurs quite a bit later in some cases for these movies. You know, people watch all of the movies and then they do all of the recall. But there's no primacy effect, and I was pretty surprised by that. It makes you think that there's something about storytelling that actually the content of first scenes tends to be a bit unmemorable. But there you go. It does not look like classic wordless learning. All right, so how is narrative event structure related to later memory? We're going to be turning each movie into a graph where the nodes are individual events and the edges are either semantic similarity between events or a cause-effect link. So how do we calculate those things? Well, this is how we do it. So we take each movie and we have it annotated very, very carefully. So I already showed you how the movie is broken into events based basically on director's cuts, changes of topic, locations, characters, actions. And we have it further annotated quite literally. So for people just watch the movie, and then for every event they write in natural language what they think is happening on the screen. Annotations exactly like this are publicly available for the Sherlock movie. And we had them done for the 10 Film Fest movies too. And then what you can do is convert every sentence of this annotation into sentence embedding, and we use Google's Universal Sentence Encoder for this. So you could take every segment and just like you use Word2Vec or GloVe for individual words, you do this for an entire sentence, or you could give it a whole paragraph. We do it at the sentence level. And you get a vector, 512 element vector back, where the cosine similarity between the vectors is supposed to tell you the similarity in their meaning, right? So actually you can make a trajectory here in 512 dimensional space as you progress through the movie. And that gives you the ability to make a similarity matrix with correlation or cosine similarity. So here you can see after we got the movie annotations, what that similarity matrix looks like across all 10 movies. So you'll tend to see stronger similarity between sentences within a movie because they're mostly on the same material, and a bit less strong between movies. And just to validate the kind of robustness of this method, we had the annotation done by 3 different independent coders. And now I'm taking that 512 dimensional trajectory, and we use TSNE here to project it down into 2 dimensions. And that really shows you I think how good this method is. So it's not surprising because the sentence encoder is trained to do this, but it wasn't necessarily trained on exactly the same kind of sentences that we're using now. So we just wanted to check. So 3 totally independent coders. Those are the 3 similarity matrices and the projections in 2-dimensional space. They look quite similar to each other. And you can look at it at the movie level too, just to see kind of how fine-grained that similarity is. Okay, so in the end, we average across these 3 coders for our similarity matrices. And I want to actually take a tangent for a couple slides to talk about these trajectories, even though it's not the main portion of the results that I'm going to show you today. But I think the trajectories are an interesting approach as well, and it's starting to accrue some interest in neuroscience, so in human memory anyway. So if you take the 10 movies, here the segmentation grain's a bit coarser than what I showed you on the previous page. So every movie is a different color of dots here. You can also do that same sentence embedding analysis and create trajectories for each person's recall, right? So every sentence that they say during their recall also becomes a vector, and then you could make the same kind of projection. So this is an example of one person's recall, and here are all of the subjects' recalls, and you can quickly see that some people talk a lot more than others, and you can see that they don't necessarily, it's not that easy to see, but they don't necessarily visit the movies in the same order, right? I showed you the order effects already. Okay, so that's what the recall trajectories look like. And definitely also take a look at Heiser, Fitzpatrick, and Manning's preprint doing the same trajectory analysis with topic modeling on the Sherlock data. So what could you learn from trajectories like this? In a way, it's just a different visualization of exactly the same data, right? So what more can you get from trajectories? I think people are interested in this. You can look at the shape of them and ask how the shape may predict things about the brain or about behavior. You may be able to look at questions about the speed with which the mind is traveling, or this question for memory about an event horizon. As you approach a target memory, is there some kind of radius around that memory in mental space that if you cross the threshold, you definitely will remember it? Questions that I think data like this could help us address. So we're interested in what kinds of travel in memory space precede successful memory retrieval. If this is your day and you're remembering what you did today, as you travel from memory to memory, what does that route through semantic space look like? Are you going basically gradually drifting towards the next target of your remembering? Or will that work the best? Or might it work a bit better sometimes to take a detour and go to a strange, unfamiliar part of space and then be refreshed when you come back to the memory that you're seeking? I think that in this data set, there's a special property that is going to allow us to look at this eventually. It's also a moment to showcase the variability in people's behavior here. So here you're looking at the recall of 3 different subjects, and if you're seeing rainbow-colored patches, it's telling you that that is time that people are actually producing words. So subject 1 speaks almost continuously. There are very few of those white bars, the gaps in between speech. Subject 2 also speaks pretty continuously, but takes longer pauses. You can see in the beginning of their speech, and then towards the end, they have these huge, long pauses where they're really searching their memory hard. And part of their instructions was, take your time. If you think that you still have something to remember and you can't quite get it, just try. And so that super long pause towards the end of their recall is actually about 2 minutes long. And then they do successfully remember 2 more movies. And then subject 3 is a totally different kind of person where they talk for a little bit and they have a lot of frequent pauses. So all of this is just to show you that we have these pauses, these moments of memory search that I think could be fruitful for asking about the relationship between trajectory properties and successful recall. And one result I can show you is that we can predict, this is PMC, posterior medial cortex activity, we can predict which movie people are about to recall quite a few seconds, maybe 10 seconds before they actually start talking about it, which is a replication of a kind of word recall work from Sean Pollan. So this is very early stages. If you're interested in learning more about what people are thinking about these kinds of trajectories during movie states and others, the overall goal really is to relate behavior to these neural trajectories. And I'll show you, point you in a couple of places. So I already mentioned Jeremy Manning, Andy Heiser, and Fitzpatrick's work on how brain activity is sensitive to the shape of ongoing experience. Tseng and Popank just published this really cool paper about how transition rate during resting state is related to trait neuroticism. And this is Hyun, Kleinbaum, and Parkinson showing that intersubject similarity of trajectories predicts social network proximity during movie viewing. So please go check out those cool papers from our friends and colleagues. Okay, back to the graph stuff. So how is narrative event structure related to later memory? We're going to be turning each movie into a graph, and now we have a way to calculate the edges using semantic similarity. I also told you that we want to look at cause-effect links because that was really the thing that came out of those behavioral studies. Our hypothesis is going to be that events that are more interconnected with others are the ones that are going to be best recalled. And let me show you the networks. So here are the semantic similarity matrices and the networks. These are calculated automatically from the sentence embeddings for the 10 movies. And so above, you see the similarity matrices for each movie. And below, you see the graph representation of that exact same data. They're just thresholded arbitrarily so you can kind of see the shape. So if you look at Catch Me If You Can, for example, down at the bottom, you can see that it's got one little cluster and one big cluster, basically. And if you have seen this clip, you'll know that at the beginning, it starts out as a game show. You can kind of see that in the similarity matrix, and then it switches totally to a flashback where he's in prison in France many years earlier. So they're quite different in a lot of ways, those two scenes, those two segments of the movie. Now I'll show you the ones that we get using cause-effect connections. We tried for a while to derive the cause-effect connections from the semantic similarity. I really wanted an automatic way to calculate them. We could not do it. They actually contain different information, it turns out. So we're doing this with human judgments and also see Song's preprint on collecting causal relationships in the same way. So we just have people watch the movies and then give them the events and say, tell us where you see a cause-effect relationship. So these matrices are a lot sparser. There are not as many cause-effect relationships. For semantic similarity, you can get a score for every single cell. For cause-effect relationships, somebody has to see one for it to appear. And you can see that the matrices and the graphs look quite different from the semantic similarity ones. And here's some of them side by side, just so you can compare. I put up the rock here because the green one, I really laughed when I first saw this because, it's a bit anecdotal, but if you watch this movie, it is about the life cycle of what happens to this mountain through the course of human history. It goes through different stages of human history over the years and is ground down into a tiny pebble and eventually shot in a rocket back out into outer space where he becomes a mountain again. So there is a cyclical aspect to the story that's very obvious, and the graph happened to reflect that. So there's something going on here that I think is interesting to see. Okay, so we have two different kinds of networks. How are we going to relate this to memory? Well, we can take our story network and calculate the degree centrality for every movie event. That is literally a measure of how connected events are to other events. And in the pictures I showed you here, the bubbles were sized according to the degree centrality already. And we can also go to the recall transcript and have it scored for which events people were talking about. So for every sentence of every person's recall, you link it, you have somebody decide what part of the movie they were talking about, and then that way you can get a probability of recall score for every movie event. And now you can just correlate these two traces, degree centrality for movie events against the probability of recall for movie events. And what we see is a relationship. So on the top, you're looking at the semantic centrality results, and the bottom is the causality centrality results. And on the left, it's all of the events for all of the movies together. And on the right, we do a median split for high and low centrality, and then you can see how well the effect replicates in every one of the 10 movies. And so it is present for semantic centrality as well as causality and centrality. And if you control for causality centrality, semantic centrality still explains successful event recall and vice versa. So they have some they are correlated with each other as well. They have some shared information and some non-overlapping information. And this particular result we have pre-registered a replication for with 10 new movies. Data are collected. We're just analyzing them now. Now the brain activity. So the first thing that you may want to see is where does activity scale with event centrality during recall. I'm showing you movie and recall here. So on the top left, you see the map for movie brain activity scaling with semantic centrality. And you have some early sensory regions as well as precuneus. It's a bit generalized. And the same for causality centrality, maybe a bit more widespread. During recall, I think, is the interesting thing. So on the top, semantic centrality scales during recall. Semantic centrality scales with brain activity during recall in precuneus and posterior medial cortex more generally, and lateral parietal cortex, so default mode key nodes. And you see the same thing during causality centrality. So these are regions that are typically active during memory retrieval, and you see them actually scaling with the both kinds of centrality of the narrative. Another thing that we look at is intersubject pattern similarity. So I didn't talk about this at all yet, but we do a technique where we compare the multivoxel patterns directly across people's brains during movie and during recall, and you will see similar activity if people are being exposed to the same stimulus. So here we're going to do this in a parcel-wise manner, so comparing event by event the pattern of activity in a given parcel between two subjects. And here we're using the Schaefer parcellation. So during movie, there you're looking at the posterior medial cortex, the orange ROI. That's the correlation across people during movie and during recall. Remember, during recall, there's no input. They're just talking and saying anything they want. And then you can see in the entire map the similarity between people during recall. This is a straight replication of what we looked at in the Sherlock paper. So we use Searchlight there, and we use parcels now. But again, you see posterior medial cortex and other members of the default mode network. Okay. But the thing that we actually care about here is how this measure might scale with centrality of the events in the narrative. I'm going to skip this for now. I included this slide because I know people here may be interested in the kind of grain of the patterns that drive some of these intersubject effects, but feel free to ask me about it in questions. Okay, so we're looking in the posterior medial cortex region, a hub of the default network, and one of the strongest regions for reactivation during recollection. And what we find is that the patterns converge across subjects for higher semantic centrality events. So here you're looking at the events split into high and low semantic centrality. And during the movie, you see that on average, patterns of activity are more similar across people for high semantic centrality events than for low. And it's actually the opposite pattern in early visual cortex, which might be, we didn't necessarily expect it to go the opposite way, but it could be because if events are being judged to be more similar to other events, it's because they actually contain some of the same content. They actually are in the same location or contain the same people. They have features that are similar. And yet it's the high centrality events that are more similar across people than the low semantic centrality events. In recall, you see the same pattern. So now there's nothing on the screen at all, but you still see on average that in posterior medial cortex, events with high semantic centrality are also more convergent in their patterns across people. So kind of two ways to think about what that means. One is from the perspective of signal reliability. So if you kind of think that all people are the same, every person provides a measurement. And so if this were the kind of experiment where you were measuring the same thing over and over, you'd say, well, if people were trials, we would say that this pattern is more stable across measurements, across repetitions. If you come from the perspective that people are really different from each other, you may prefer to characterize it as synchrony. So high centrality events might be eliciting a more similar or canonical interpretation than low centrality events. And I think both of these, they're not incompatible. They're just different ways of thinking about this, this result of convergence across subjects. Okay. One thing you might be wondering at this point is there an actual signature of high centrality then? Is it every time that the more central that an event is degree centrality in a narrative, then there's this like centrality pattern that appears, and that's why all of them are similar to each other. We wondered that, and so we looked at the classification accuracy for individual scenes to see what their distinctiveness is. And this is what we see. So on the left, first just the raw classification accuracy scores on the top for the movie, for PMC and for early visual cortex. So here, remember there are around 200 events, so chance is that dotted line that's almost at zero. And classification accuracy across this, I think this is between, we take the subjects and split it into two groups, and average. So it's an average to an average, but they are two independent groups of subjects. So you can see that classification accuracy in early visual cortex is extremely high, and I think it's pretty high in PMC as well, for both high and low semantic centrality events during the movie. If you look below that during recall, you can see that in visual cortex there you can no longer classify across subjects these individual event patterns during recall. There's no visual input, and so the PMC is carrying the show here. On the right now, what we're showing, I'm going to the far right here because it's the same result. The movie distinctiveness score is just the cross-subject classification accuracy for that event. And what you see is that high centrality events are not all the same as each other. They're actually more distinctive than low centrality events. So it's not that there's a kind of repeating signature of high centrality every time the event is more connected to other events. It actually means that those high centrality events are more distinct, and there's a kind of clearer signal, you might say, for each one. They're different from each other. Okay. Now, we didn't see any of that stuff for causality centrality. We just didn't. So everything's flat. And even though they both predicted memory behavior really strongly, we see those effects in posterior medial cortex for semantic centrality, not for causality centrality. And that was a bit puzzling, but I think it is what it is. So both of them drive behavior. They have some shared variance and some non-shared, and only the semantic effects seem to be present, at least in posterior medial cortex. You know, with some, I will say there's a little hint of something going on for causality centrality in lateral parietal cortex, but it's so weak that I wouldn't say that it is popping out at all. You know, so that was a question, and I'll refer you again to look at Sung and L's paper where they look at cause-effect relationships in stories in more detail. All right, and finally, we can look at all of the movies together. So we've been looking at just one movie at a time and all of the results that have shown up until now. But of course, all people saw all of the movies and tried to remember all of the movies. And so you can put everything into one big matrix and ask about how the between event information might be represented. And here we take the movie annotation similarity matrix generated from the sentence embeddings, and we compare it wholesale to the recall fMRI data. So that's your representational similarity analysis, movie text versus recall brain data. And here you see posterior medial cortex parcels and some lateral parietal and some medial prefrontal cortex default network parcels that are some of the strongest matches between the kind of semantic content of the movie and the recall brain activity during recall of those same movies. All right. So kind of last thing I want to say here is, you know, we talked about how this little story, and any story, isn't just a list of words, and it isn't just a list of ideas. It's a list of events that are connected to each other by shared elements like semantic similarity and their cause-effect links. But there is still something missing. It isn't just a list of events connected to each other in a static network. This network develops across time. And all of the graph measures that I showed you are calculated using all of the annotation or all of the recall. But probably if you want to really respect the fact that things are dynamically unfolding across time, you would want to recalculate these graphs using only the elements that have happened already up to this moment. So that is something that we're thinking about. I think it is not as easy as what I just said, because it looks like people have the ability to predict the centrality of an event without having seen the rest of the movie. We have some behavioral evidence showing that. And so in a way, they are building the future of the story, and they have some access to it, even though it hasn't happened yet. So this is a pretty complicated topic, and you will have to stay tuned to see what we end up doing here. So the kind of last thing that I want to say about this is that, my thinking about the use of narratives for studying memory and the brain has changed over time, and I want to share that with you. So at the beginning, I thought, well, I want to use movies because it's more realistic input for the brain. We care about how the brain enacts memory in the real world in our daily lives, and movies are kind of the closest that we can get to that in the scanner, it seemed. They're these kind of dynamic experiences, very rich detail, audiovisual, multisensory, and so that's why they were interesting. And a little later I thought, actually, the movies are not that realistic. They are super stimuli, right? They're much more temporally compressed and more exciting and more dramatic than anything that happens to you in your real life most of the time. And they have very high value as well. People love to watch them, and they spend billions of dollars globally doing this. So they are a kind of crafted super stimulus that are designed to drive brains in a way that is not exactly like your everyday life. There's something else. And then recently my thinking about it changed even more. And I came to think that narratives are really an important class of stimuli in their own right. They may be super stimuli, but they are old. They are old enough to have influenced human evolution and brain evolution. Stories are the way that we communicate our memories to other people. They're the way that we kind of understand the events of our own lives and decide who we are. Memory is often produced as a story to yourself or to others. And so I think narratives are real stimuli. They are out in the wild, and especially in the context of memory, they are as real as anything in the world. Thank you to my collaborators on both of these projects and to my funding sources, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Okay, thanks very much. That was an excellent talk. We have some time for questions.
Should I leave my slide up? I can't see you guys, but it's okay.
I don't think you'll be able to see people unless I invite them to the screen, but yeah. Currently, so I'll ask you the first question. So I'm gonna kick your slides out off. Yes, I was wondering if you're seeing any hippocampal effects in all this, like, so what happened in the campus? Yeah.
So in the Sherlock data, we looked at the hippocampus a little bit. And we did see that we could predict subsequent memory a bit with intersubject similarity, at least in terms of mean activity. So the kind of time course similarity between people for a given scene could predict the probability of recall a bit. I didn't see anything in pattern similarity. And in this new data set, I really haven't looked very carefully yet. That's kind of at the top of the list to have a look there. But in general, I don't see incredibly strong inter-subject pattern similarity effects in the hippocampus, predicting recall. Yeah, there's other work on this topic. Mark Coutanche has a nice new paper looking at inter-subject pattern similarity and immediate and delayed recall.
Thanks, cool. So we have a couple of questions. So I'm inviting people to the screen. To ask a question, if you don't want, please say that in the chat. Praveen, I've invited you now to ask your question. Always takes a bit of time. Okay, I can start asking the questions for now. So Praveen is asking, I have first-hand experience, I'm sure others have too, but sometimes I dream about seemingly unrelated events. In other words, events happened in the past and are completely unrelated, but somehow these unrelated events blend together during sleep. Any thoughts or studies on this? Thanks.
How events may blend together during dreams and sleep. I don't think that this work is going to speak to that at all. There isn't very much work on kind of measuring these kinds of neural representations during active sleep and during active dreaming. It's pretty difficult work to do, as you can imagine. Yeah. I mean, during sleep, that is the time when kind of connections between events may be formed and enriched. And certainly after sleep, you might expect some of these centrality effects to be magnified because the kind of important connections should be the ones that tend to remain, and the unimportant ones may fall out. So I guess I would predict that with sleep, or maybe with longer multi-day delays, that these centrality effects should be enhanced. Maybe via interactions between the default network and the hippocampus as well.
Interesting. Thanks. And the next question is from Avital. I'll ask for her. Thanks for a great talk. I was wondering about your choice of NLP model. Does this model perform better than a simple bag of words model in predicting brain activity or behavior?
Well, so we did compare at the validation stage. We didn't take it all the way to the brain, but I will say that the inter-rater similarity of those event by event, what you're seeing right now, that correlation matrix, similarity matrix, is a lot better using the sentence embedding model than the word model. I think that it's much better. So I'm happy to connect offline with you about that stuff. But I think that if you can, the stuff that we're measuring here is sentences, and I think that it benefits you to use the sentence level one rather than the word level one for this kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is from Xin Ming. Will participants recall high centrality events with higher precision?
I actually haven't checked that. It is something that we have the ability to look at. One of the other types of coding that we commonly do in my lab is looking at kind of the temporal precision and detail of the description of each event. So this is something that, I guess my prediction would be that it might go the other way, because when you summarize, when you generate summary statements or kind of wrap-up statements about an event or a thing that's going on in the narrative, you're synthesizing things potentially from different parts of the story, right? So I guess I think that the high centrality events are more likely to contain kind of these synthesis or summary statements, maybe in addition to detail. But I think those are probably the places where you're going to find those synthesis statements.
Yeah. Thanks. And next question is from Sam, who I invited to the screen. In the meantime, I can start. Here he is. Great.
Hello.
Hi.
Very, very good and interesting talk. So my question, you didn't find any neural effects associated with the causal structure of events, but to me, like a very appealing idea is that kind of causal relationships are kind of coded by some sort of like a different code that's not easily detectable by fMRI. So, for instance, like some sort of temporal code or like a rate coding scheme, which wouldn't be easily detected by fMRI. That might be completely crazy. I don't know about this area at all, and this might be a very naive question. So if it is, I apologize. But I was wondering whether anyone else has, or whether you know of any other literature that have looked at kind of how causal relationships between events are coded. Like, for instance, in the rodent literature, has anyone looked at this, and whether it's feasible to look for that kind of coding with fMRI?
I mean, so I'm not going to be able to give you a very good answer here because I didn't come to this work from those literatures. But I think, I certainly don't see the same effects for the cause-effect relationships as I do for the semantic relationships, right? The paper that I pointed to in the slides, the Song paper, Song et al., what they do there is they have, it's also an fMRI paper, and they have movie narratives that people watched, and then they look at moments where people feel that they are kind of understanding what's happening. So kind of moments of comprehension, those are linked to understanding that a cause-effect relationship has happened. And they look there at kind of global connectivity patterns and the properties of global networks. So at least there you have some evidence that you can detect something with fMRI that's related to these cause-effect relationships. I would say that the particular measures that we were using here, the intersubject similarity of multivoxel patterns in the default network, that's what I did not see. But I don't think that it's inaccessible to fMRI.
Cool. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks very much. So the next question is from Peter, who I have invited to the screen. I'll give it 1 minute. I'll start asking his question for now. He says, great talk. I didn't fully understand. There he is. Great.
Hi, Dennis. Great talk. Thank you.
Hi, Peter.
Yeah, I was curious about those opposite effects you found in PMC and early visual cortex, where it was, I think, semantic centrality that had opposite effects there. I didn't fully understand why that might be, and I was wondering if you could go into about that a bit more, or speculate on why that might.
Yeah, well, I would be speculating. I expected it to be flat, and instead it went the opposite. And I think our kind of leading idea about it is that if you have events that are judged to be similar to other events, it's because they have overlapping elements of some kind, right? So let's say that these central events all happen in a similar location. There's like outside, inside, everything happens in Sherlock's apartment. Then those central events will have a lot of sensory features that overlap as well. And it may be that the repetition drives down the pattern similarity in visual cortex. That's one idea for what could be happening.
Like a repetition suppression type phenomenon. Okay. Yeah, because in general, there's often, it seems to be the case that whenever kind of visual cortex goes up, default mode network goes down, and the other way around. Right, with some ideas of maybe default mode network being more about internal endogenous stimuli or signals and exogenous stimuli in visual cortex. Could there be anything to that, or is that a different way of phrasing the same point?
It's not the same because this isn't just mean activity that we're talking about, right? It's like an actual multivoxel pattern in these regions. So it's a similarity between people that's going up and down, and that is related to the mean activity, but not in a totally straightforward way. So I think, your point is good that we should also just look at the mean activity and see if there's some kind of correlation between the default network and the visual regions. But, I don't think it's going to be kind of as cut and dry as that.
Well,
unfortunately,
I didn't mean to suggest it could be like that just in a non-interesting way, but just that this default mode network may be more involved in processing associations you have, etc., which come from your memory, whereas visual cortex may be more processing exogenous inputs. So maybe there's an interesting way for why these patterns are.
Yeah, certainly the fact that there's a very slight pattern still like that during recall, I think goes with your suggestion, right? Because then it's not going to be a visual repetition suppression explanation during recall.
Yeah. Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Cool, we have a couple more questions. One question is from Robert. Your point on the temporal evolution of narratives is really interesting. Do you think this could be achieved using fMRI, or would something like MEG be better suited?
Oh, well, the temporal evolution I was talking about is still over the scale of minutes. So I don't think there's anything that prevents us from doing the analysis in fMRI. It's at the same grain as the analysis we're already doing. I'm talking about, imagine that the graph that we make of the events, this is the graph of all of the events in the story. But as your brain data is collected in time, so at event 1, you really only have one node. And at event 2, you have 2 nodes, right? So there is something kind of odd, at least during the movie data, of saying, well, I have this entire network of events. I'm going to calculate properties from all of the events, even though at each moment, at each node, because every node is a moment in time, I didn't have all of the graph yet, right? That's the point I was making. So I don't think that we necessarily, maybe we could benefit from higher temporal resolution, but I think that we could do a lot to investigate this temporal unfolding of narrative given the resolution that we have. Now, for recall, in a way, you can do the analysis with all of the events because now you have seen everything, right? Even though you're only recalling one event at a time, you have access to the entire graph already. So I think they're different in important ways there.
Yeah. Cool, thanks. And we have one last question, again from Vital. So posterior medial cortex seems to pop up in most naturalistic fMRI studies. Why do you think that is? What is special about this region in comparison to other default mode network regions in the context of narrative processing? Yeah, I also want to ask, the fact that you don't see anything in medial frontal cortex is quite interesting, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, if you think about Chris Baldessano's work, he really focuses on the kind of higher level schema that many different stories may fit into. And when you look at questions like that, you're more likely to see medial prefrontal cortex. I'm going to answer the question in a different way, though. So if you look at the hierarchy of timescales across the cortex, so these are experiments done in Uri Hassan's lab and friends, where you take an entire movie or a story and you scramble it in finer and finer pieces. And you look at where in the brain you're still going to see reliable intersubject activity. The time scale of posterior medial cortex is a little shorter than the time scale of medial prefrontal cortex, and maybe about the same as lateral parietal, or maybe even a bit shorter. So I think it's kind of easier for us to get posterior medial cortex. It doesn't require quite as much, it doesn't have as long of an integration window as some of those other regions. So I think that's probably part of the answer, and that could be explored, I think, by looking at by looking at stimuli that have necessary temporal dependencies that are at a shorter and longer scale.
Mm. Yeah, cool, interesting.
I mean, also posterior medial cortex is kind of the hub of the default network, and so it may well be that Other regions of the default network, like medial prefrontal and lateral parietal, have a bit of a specialty, and posterior medial kind of just isn't as specialized. So more stimuli. People are choosing these stimuli from all over the space of cinema, and it doesn't matter quite as much which one you use.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, and thanks a lot for a really great talk and super interesting, super cool result.
Thank you.
So thanks everybody for joining us. Yeah, and see you soon.
Thanks.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. There's some people can clap on the chat. Yeah. There we go. Okay, I'm gonna end the broadcast now. Yeah.
Okay.